Hi, I'm Eric K. Washington. The New York Society Library has invited me to give a talk about my book, Boss of the Grips, The Life of James H. Williams and the Red Caps of Grand Central Terminal. This is a biography of a man who, for almost a half a century, headed a workforce of Harlem-based African-American men at what is arguably the world's most famous railroad station. These men, known as red cap porters because of their headwear, were assigned to carrying your bags as you arrived at the station or when you disembarked from a train, and also to give you information for where you wanted to get to, either a taxi or a subway, or what platform you needed to be on to catch your line. As a New York Central Railroad employee, James H. Williams ushered statesmen, movie stars, society elite, sports heroes, high clergy, and other notables to and from trains with marginal visibility. But he stood out conspicuously among African Americans as the chief, who created a platform to employ black men, to sustain black students, and to showcase the race in the most admirable light. In this capacity, as the boss of the grips, he was part of the central nervous system of the Harlem Renaissance, the storied era from about the end of World War I through the mid-1930s of Harlem's cultural, literary, and artistic expression. In 1952, 4 years after Williams died, New Yorker magazine writer E.B. White made an observation about porters in the railroad. The nature of a porter's work tends to put him in a class with beasts of burden. And this was not a damning observation, just an observation, but it was telling. And it was part of what interested me in knowing more about Williams, who I discovered while giving tours at Grand Central for the centennial of the terminal in 2013. So I'll give some background on my subject that traces his coinciding rise to prominence at both the Grand Central Terminal and in the New York neighborhood of Harlem. I began my book with an almost century-old epigram. At the Grand Central is a colored man who probably knows more people than any other Negro in New York. He is Chief James H. Williams, head of the Red Caps of the station. That appeared in the New York Age in 1923. And I started with that comment because it reminded me constantly as I was working on the book of how considerably well-known Williams once was, and how iconic was his workforce. Like the Pullman porters, the Red Caps' African-American railroading kin, the station-bound Red Caps were crucial to the Swiss watch precision that the terminal was known for. Moreover, their relegated position of servitude was inextricably woven into the beguiling experience of early 20th century American railroad travel. So who was James H. Williams? He was born on August 4th, 1878, in a tenement at 227 West 15th Street in Manhattan. The building still stands in the neighborhood that is now the fashionable district of Chelsea. Both of his parents were from Virginia, and each was formerly enslaved, although his father escaped on the Underground Railroad, it's said. And young Williams grew up within these adjacent precincts of the gritty Tenderloin district's striving Black Belt, also the bohemian Tin Pan Alley music publishing houses, and the thriving carriage trade of the fashionable Broadway district, where his father was incidentally a hotel waiter at Sturtevant House. And this district was underscored with lively theaters and flower shops. He attended colored school number 4 when it had become known as grammar school number 81. He never went beyond grade school, but his education was all but elementary. He graduated from one of New York's City's 2 racial caste schools that were in the part of the Board of Ed system. Grammar School number 81 at 128 West 17th Street, which also still stands, was formerly Colored School number 4, which grew out of the late 18th century African free schools. His particular school was headed by the city's first black public school principal, noted educator Sarah J. Tompkins, who was made a principal in 1873 during the Civil War. And she strove really to uplift the race as diligently as to raise grade averages. Sarah Tompkins later married Reverend Henry Highland Garnett. He was one of America's foremost black abolitionists and orators. It might be noted that in the 1880 U.S. Census, which is the first one that Williams appears on, he's 2 years old, there's a teacher at the colored school, Richard Robinson, who also lives in his building. So already he is in close proximity to people who are connected with black education in the city and who are very much a part of the community. Richard Robinson is also the music teacher for Colored School number 3. At the time that Williams was attending these schools, there are only 2 of the colored schools left. And that other school was where Elizabeth Jennings Graham was a teacher. School teacher Elizabeth Jennings had sued the Third Avenue Railroad Company in 1855, winning a legal victory that had set a precedent towards desegregating the city's public conveyances. But it was the ruling of this benchmark case that was not swiftly achieved, that, the ruling of this benchmark case was not swiftly achieved. Indeed, the ensuing decade, marked by the Civil War, had passed when New Yorkers publicly venerated the cause's most conspicuous champion, abolitionist Peter S. Porter, in 1867, with a gold-headed cane for services in obtaining equal rights in public conveyances. It was without a doubt that young James Williams, his close proximity to Jennings and Porter, both looming heroes of those so-called horse car wars, that bolstered his formal childhood education. Not to mention that Porter's mansion, as the tenement where Peter S. Porter lived, it was a hotel for black travelers on West 26th Street, and this was a community pillar of James's earliest years. Also, James's teenage work experience supplemented his formal schooling invaluably. He was a flower messenger for the renowned Gilded Age florist Charles Thorley. Charles Thorley was a well-known black employer. It said that his shops were virtually managed by African Americans. And this work, while he was just a messenger as a boy, exposed Williams to influential society and political figures. It was around 1903 that Williams and his wife Lucy moved their young family up to West 134th Street in Harlem. They were part of the first discernible wave of African Americans that anticipated the famous decades-long Great Migration that was soon to come. Williams arrived in Harlem as a man of potential influence. Around 1905, the founding of Manhattan's first Colored Elks Lodge, Manhattan Lodge number 45, coincided with his own apparent distinction, from having worked for Thorley in the flower shop to now having broken the color line at Grand Central Terminal among the Redcaps. There's a very mellow picture of Williams that belies his spirit of community activism. Just his subtle lapel pin in this photo, where he's in a tuxedo, affirmed Williams' affiliation with a controversial fraternal order that was emerging as institutional forerunners of the modern civil rights movement. A member of his lodge, a man by the name of Ulrich Johnson, had been arrested for wearing this insignia that Williams is seen wearing. It's a little a pin that looks like the head of an elk with antlers. And he had defied the Grattan Bill by wearing it. The Grattan Bill was instituted by a New York State legislator by the name of William Grattan, who was a white elk. And whites were protesting the wearing of insignia of the Elks fraternal order by African Americans. And this fraternal order had become very, very popular and was spreading at a rapid rate among blacks. And on penalty of being arrested or fined or beaten up in the street, Williams, although he's just very mellow in this photo, wearing this little lapel pin, is actually defying the law. And upon the arrest of this lodge member, his elk lodge goes into action. A lot of the members are lawyers and businessmen, very influential people in the African American community in New York. And upon a lot of back and forth arguments, they actually win the case, and they win the right to wear their insignia, particularly because they are part of a lodge, part of a group that is uninvited and disinvited to become members of the White Elks Lodge. So this particular action that they win in the courts is really a forerunner to the next generation of whom they are the progenitors, who will be involved in the civil rights acts of the 50s and the 60s in the decades that will follow. I was fascinated by how Williams's life of nearly 70 years wove through major historic eras and events of the late 19th century and through the mid-20th century in America, springing from the American Civil War and Reconstruction era of his parents. His own life encompassed the Gilded Age, the Gay 90s, World War I, the Great Migration, Prohibition, literary and artistic era known as the Harlem Renaissance, and the Great Depression and World War II. For 45 of his nearly 70 years, Williams was a railroad man. It was in 1903 that the 24-year-old Williams was hired onto Grand Central Terminal's so-called free attendant service. Till Williams' hire, the workforce then was all white, but as it was the station's lowest ranking job, disgruntled white redcaps moved to higher station departments. However, the color line barred black workers from similar promotions, and within a year of Williams' hire in 1903, the redcap workforce was all black. And this adversity thrust Williams into untypical celebrity. It was not one from the stage or music or high society, but it was a celebrity based on labor service occupation. Racial uplift was the urgent theme of Williams's time, and it had once inspired Reverend W.H. Brooks, a prominent local leader he knew, to proclaim a sort of strategy. If we cannot move forward, let us mark time. And indeed, Williams himself took what seemed deliberate steps towards this goal when in 1909 he accepted a promotion as chief attendant, Grand Central Terminal's first and most notable African-American officer until his death in 1948. And the timing was auspicious for Williams. He appeared really aptly positioned for the new role, having a foot firmly planted in two of Gotham's principal enclaves that were each dubbed a city within a city. Grand Central was the so-called terminal city, comprising the station's campus of shops, restaurants, galleries, offices, hotels, etc. And Harlem was described as the largest Negro community in the world, a part of and yet apart from the general life of greater New York. In picturing Williams between his workplace and home, we can easily imagine his singular vantage point towards emerging as a leader. I think Williams's leadership revealed itself in a few particular ways. He took stewardship of his workforce's welfare through life's unscripted hardships. He strove to sustain its morale through both rewarding and challenging times. But especially he infused a dull job of servitude with a sense of motivational purpose. And there was a particular incident soon after Williams's promotion as chief attendant in 1909 that gives a sense of his strong conviction. On the evening of September 14th in 1909, Williams summoned a throng of Redcap station attendants from Grand Central to True Reformers Hall on West 53rd Street. And despite the growing exodus up to Harlem at this time, this street in what's today's Hell's Kitchen was still a hub of black life. And the newly appointed Williams had summoned them, all these men, to this church to organize the Attendants Beneficial Association of Grand Central Terminal. At Grand Central itself, Redcaps had been working in and around fully functional railroad service, all the while the construction crews were building up the new terminal around the old station. Not surprisingly, a fatal station accident had claimed one of Williams's men the month before. More personally, his invalid baby daughter succumbed in the hospital a week later. And such urgencies made Redcaps acutely self-aware. They were uninsured, unsalaried, and dependent upon tips. And this predicament prompted Williams's first major demonstration of his new influential position among the men. Chief Williams's call to action spurred his Redcap porters to organize their own beneficial association, composed exclusively of Grand Central employees, to aid members in case of sickness, injury, or death. The men duly elected Chief Williams as president of their new mutual aid society. They also elected his assistant chief as sergeant-at-arms, Samuel Jesse Battle, who was then studying for the occupation that would thrust him into history on New York City's police force. And this incident, I think, from their nascent years, paints a telling picture of how James H. Williams began organizing Grand Central's station porters through then mostly fraternal and grassroots-based initiatives. It was distinct from the collective bargaining-based organization of A. Philip Randolph's Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters in 1925, although that model would later inspire Willard Townsend to found the Redcaps' own similar organization in 1937, as the Great Depression drove the wave of national union movements. But in that decades-long span of Williams's tenure, we can glimpse the impressive breadth of the Redcaps' impact on both Grand Central and on Greater Harlem. I mentioned that Williams ushered statesmen, movie stars, society elite, sports heroes, other notables to and from trains with marginal visibility. Yet he was a master of tactful presence. It was said that no Grand Central passenger can consider himself a big shot until Jim has personally met him. Indeed, like an emissary, he was confidant to many a big shot, white and black alike. But he was conspicuously the chief among African Americans. He was a race man who turned the gateway to the American continent, as the Grand Central Terminal was referred to, into a highly coveted employment gateway towards middle-class black life. Williams took great pride in having given New York City two of its first black uniformed civil servants. His assistant chief, Samuel Jesse Battle, broke New York's police department's color line in 1911. And in 1919, the chief's own son, Wesley Williams, became Manhattan's first black fireman. Out of 1,700 applicants, Wesley Williams was not only the sole African American, but the only candidate to score 100% on the physical exam. Subsequent promotions for Wesley in 1927, 1933, and 1938 made Wesley the city's first black lieutenant, captain, and battalion chief, respectively. Wesley's all-around athleticism and heroism on duty were widely reported, and he went on to co-found the Vulcan Society, a fraternal organization of New York's black firefighters that for years combated racial discrimination within the city department. There's an interesting story that goes with Wesley's first promotion to lieutenant. It was rumored in 1927 that when Wesley was to be promoted, that the promotion was going to go through, but that the plan was to assign him a desk job so that he would not be visible as a black man supervising white firemen. And this was one of the things that kind of helped to illustrate his father, Chief Williams of the Redcaps, his influence. This obviously would not have been a triumphant promotion if he was scurried out of sight. So his father, Chief Williams, talks to people who he's come to know in the course of his job at the terminal, one of whom is Senator Robert Wagner, who is well known as an advocate of equal rights. He's prominent in the anti-lynching movement, which is going on at the time, and he sympathizes with this being a very bad idea, that Wesley should be hidden from the rest of the crew and indeed from the rest of the city. So he suggests to Chief Williams that he contact the Catholic Archbishop of New York, Cardinal Hayes. And Williams writes a letter to Hayes asking that he use his influence to help Wesley to keep the position. And we don't have a corresponding response from Cardinal Hayes, or we don't even know if there was one, but we do know that Wesley's wish was granted, and he ended up spending the rest of his career at Engine Company number 55 on Broome Street in Little Italy, as he had desired. In the realm of community activism, the First World War helped to highlight Chief Williams' exemplary leadership at Grand Central. He reportedly went over the top, it was written, in rallying his men to buy Liberty bonds during the relief efforts, but he was an especially noted lifeline in supporting the numerous Redcaps who were in the ranks of the black troops recalled heroically as the Harlem Hellfighters, furnishing them with sweaters, helmets, wristlets, socks, and scarves. One paper reported, Chief Williams writes to his former comrades every 10 days. And such activity made Chief Williams a logical choice to escort Needham Roberts to a patriotic evening at Carnegie Hall on November 2nd, 1918. Roberts and Henry Johnson, who was also a Redcap for the New York Central but in Albany, were the first two Americans to receive France's highest military honor for extraordinary gallantry, the coveted Croix de Guerre. In his own town, in New York, Williams had long been active with the NAACP, whose leadership often acknowledged the chief's formidable influence over the labor community of Redcap porters. In 1929, then NAACP leader James Weldon Johnson personally thanked Williams for his habitual fundraising diligence that had made the association's most successful annual event ever. A few years later, under Walter White, who was Johnson's successor, White deferred to Williams's influence as he implored the chief to give a Redcap job to his dentist friend from Detroit, who had come to New York after an economic crash had ruined his practice. So Williams was indeed deferred to and acknowledged, his importance was acknowledged by members of the leaders in the community on all accounts, and particularly in these hard times of the Depression. In the entertainment field, Williams had previously had the ears of the NAACP on another matter, musical entertainment. Leaders Walter White and W.E.B. Du Bois had auditioned and approved the Grand Central Redcap Orchestra, which Williams had organized in 1929 to be the NAACP's touring band. Williams had established and promoted the Grand Central Red Cap Orchestra, 2 Red Cap quartets, and a choir, all of which were influential in public social life within and beyond Harlem through live, recorded, and radio broadcast performances. The musical integrity of the orchestra and quartet enabled the Red Cap musicians to be not just entertaining, but artistically autonomous, so they could hire themselves out either as a full orchestra or individually or as in the form of small combos. It also contributed to making Grand Central Terminal an uplifting holiday destination where New York locals and tourists enjoyed caroling for years. 2 years before the Christmas tree at Rockefeller Center went up, people had started going to Grand Central at holiday time to listen to the orchestra playing and Red Caps singing carols and spirituals from the balconies that overlook the main concourse. In athletics, it was perhaps Williams' son Wesley's physical gusto that inspired him to strive to bridge the really discrete worlds of Grand Central and Harlem. It was indeed Williams's name emerges in the annals of Negro League semi-pro baseball. In 1918, during the First World War, he had masterfully rebuilt the Grand Central Terminal Red Cap Baseball Club. He publicly challenged white executive Nat Strong, the most redoubtable figure in baseball bookings and playing fields, for wielding unfair control of the National Association of Colored Baseball Clubs of the United States and Cuba. Williams was not the first baseball manager to accuse Nat Strong of keeping black baseball managers out of the game. And he wrote to the papers. He took his argument to the press. And Nat Strong also was given an opportunity to answer back. One of the things that was considered particularly crafty of Williams was that this other team in Brooklyn, the Brooklyn Royals, was a star team, and he influenced them to leave Brooklyn and come to Manhattan and play with his team, with the added perk of giving them jobs as Red Caps. And in his comeback in the paper, it was in the New York Age, Nat Strong tried to make a dig at Williams by saying that if the only thing that Williams can offer his men was a job carrying bags, then what is that worth? And I think it reflected a bit of tone deafness on Strong's part, because indeed a baseball season is just that, it's a season. And when the men weren't playing, they still needed to pay their rent or feed their families or whatever. So that additional perk of having work, steady work, while they were off season was obviously important, and they took it. And they were still basically playing with each other who they had played with on the other side of the river. So they could still be a strong form of strong team. And during the Black Fives baseball era of the 1920s, sports writers typically opined that Williams's Red Cap players give promise of being even better than the Renaissance Five, a capable Harlem club at the time. But I would say that the Chiefs' name enjoyed its longest athletic tenure in the game of tennis. In 1931, the ATA, which was the American Tennis Association, this is the country's longest ongoing black athletic association. They were founded in 1916. The eponymous Williams Cup was an $800 sterling silver Tiffany Cup that was the top prize of the ATA's National Intercollegiate Championships. And it not only exalted the compatibility of physical prowess and academic ambition, it also reflected the unconventional range of Chief Williams's influence. In the social world, in Harlem's social world, the visibility of the Williamses among the first black residents of Strivers Row, the posh neighborhood that opened up to African American tenants in the early around 1920. The Williamses ascended and shone both as guests and hosts. His oldest daughter, his second child, Gertrude, who was born in 1898, was a renowned beauty in Harlem. And I say renowned in the sense that she was not just beautiful, but she won beauty pageants that were given. And she was particularly known, as was appropriate for the time, she was a flapper. And she was particularly known for the iconic bobbed hair that was fashionable at the time. There was one incident where the Pullman Porters in 1926, they had just been established the year before, they held a huge event to celebrate their organization, and part of that event was a beauty pageant that was based on bobbed hair, and the winner was Gertrude. So it was the Pullman Porters event, but it was the daughter of the chief of the Redcaps who won. And some people pointed out that it was rather appropriate. But also she was well known for, this was practically, I wouldn't say it was her signature alone, but she was well known for being one of the most fashionable of the bobbed hair wearers in Harlem. Indeed, at the same time, the Daily News ran a picture of Gertrude and two other women, and it was said to have been historic, the first time that the Daily News or a mainstream paper had run a picture of black women as beauty figures, a picture of black women that was not associated with the idea of criminal activity or something untoward. And Gertrude went on to, she had originally theatrical ambitions, but she went on to becoming a well-known manicurist in Harlem, which was not entirely out of the field of her theatrical ambitions, because she still was waiting on people who were still in the business. So it was a way of, keeping a hand in, no pun intended, with the activity of Harlem theater. And perhaps unsurprisingly, Williams counted among the 9,000 guests who had been invited to Harlem Arts patron Alelia Walker's famous $1 million wedding that she had hosted for her daughter's marriage in 1923. Chief Williams' own 5-year-old daughter, Catherine, that was his youngest child, was a flower girl at the wedding. However, his attendance was also noted at the private wedding of another society family, a white family in Westchester, the Stillman family, who were associated with they were financiers. And much was made of this in the papers, not so much to mock Williams, but actually to mock the rich white family as being sort of eccentric for having invited black guests. But Williams himself was a renowned host, as Jimmy and his gang, being the chief in his Grand Central Redcaps, he hosted free formal soirees at Harlem's Renaissance Casino and moonlight sails up the Hudson on rented yachts with the orchestra that he had organized playing on the boats. In the world of scholastics, however, I would say that Williams was probably most noted. If I harken back to that observation of New Yorker magazine writer E.B. White, that the nature of a porter's work tends to put him in a class with beasts of burden. This was true, yet the nature of their realized ambitions was in a class above most. Though Williams himself had not gone past grade school, he boasted that his scholastic record outshone any other of the terminal's departments. Paradoxically, Williams's Redcaps were so ubiquitous as to be taken for granted, yet so overqualified for these jobs as to be curiosities. Another New Yorker writer counted 5 graduate students, 1 an honor student at Harvard, several lawyers, singers, teachers of music, and other persons of some erudition and attainment. Staffing Sugar Hill, this was the terminal's Vanderbilt Avenue taxi entrance, as it was dubbed. Another article in another magazine titled PhD Carries Your Bags, emphasized that typically 40% of redcaps, about every third man in a regiment of hundreds, had college training. African-American writer George Schuyler was wryly grim on this subject. He wrote, "Turn a machine gun on a crowd of redcaps at a big railroad terminal, and you would slaughter a score or more of bachelors of arts, doctors of law, doctors of medicine, doctors of dental surgery, etc." It was in this capacity as boss of the grips, and grips were not just the actual grip of your bag, but it was the name ascribed to the redcap porters who handled these bags. Williams was part of this central nervous system of the Harlem Renaissance, that storied era. And he intersected as such with all of these notable people of his time. Some are names that we still recognize today, like Cardinal Hayes, W.E.B. Du Bois, Walter White, James Weldon Johnson, and others were figures that are perhaps less familiar, but were prominent in their time. And some are still carryovers. Bill Bojangles Robinson, Joe Louis the boxer, the singer Alberta Hunter, A'Lelia Walker, who I mentioned. And also, there were notable men who came out of the system who were yet to be notable at the time, but became names that we still would recognize today, like Paul Robeson, the singer and activist, Lester B. Granger, who went on by being able to finish his schooling while carrying bags at Grand Central, went on to head the National Urban League for many years. Adam Clayton Powell Jr., famous clergyman, but also the first African American in Congress representing the Harlem district. I don't like to pick favorites. I have a few, though. There was a fellow by the name of George Gabriel. He was from Abyssinia. It was said at the time, I don't know if this is so, that he was the only Abyssinian in America at the time. And he came here in 1913, January of 1913, at the invitation of former President Teddy Roosevelt. He had been Roosevelt's interpreter during a safari in Africa in 1909. And Roosevelt said, if you ever come to the U.S., to New York, look me up. And indeed, George Gabriel had been all over the world, but he had never been to North America. So he decided to seize this opportunity. And he gets here in January 1913. This was a month before Grand Central Terminal opened. And Roosevelt is, even with all of his influence, not able to get George Gabriel a job as an interpreter. So he uses his influence to get Gabriel another job as an interpreter at Grand Central Terminal. And it was written about that Gabriel was the official interpreter at Grand Central, but there's some doubt cast upon that because someone else did identify themselves as the official interpreter. But Gabriel was written about a lot. The only job that one could enter at Grand Central was that of redcap. And indeed, he was pressed in service when the official interpreter ran out of languages. Gabriel spoke 18 languages, but he was only paid as a redcap. But a fascinating life. Another was a man by the name of William Lonewolf Davis. He was a motorcycle enthusiast, and he used his tips from redcapping to support himself on an endurance motorcycle ride around the globe. And in 1929, he takes off from the corner of 135th Street and 7th Avenue in Harlem and goes around the globe and writes letters back to New York. So essentially he's doing travel writing, and he returns a year later in 1930. And another is Richard Huey, who came to Grand Central in 1925. He was an actor. Huey says that James Williams didn't want to hire him when he first arrived, but he actually had a letter of recommendation from W.E.B. Du Bois, which will probably do it. And Huey was well known in the theater. He was probably one of the workingest African American actors in New York in the late 1920s and 1930s and 1940s. And he was also a booking agent, so he got other black actors' work and into Actors Equity. And he was a restaurateur. He ran a popular restaurant known as Aunt Dinah's Kitchen on 135th Street, right next door to the Harlem YMCA. So those are three people among many who are all interesting in their own right, but who stick out in my mind in a flash. What does Williams matter today? I think Chief Williams is fondly likened Grand Central. He fondly likened Grand Central to an institution of higher learning. He called it the University of Human Nature. And as one graduate, journalist and politician Earl Brown, who was also a Harvard alum, who summed it up personally, only because the chief had a big heart and was proud of his race were hundreds of young colored men able to go through college. And I think in that sense, Brown's words deservingly should be the last. I think his experience illustrates how Williams embodied a unique juncture between white and black America. His influential 45-year tenure made the monumental railroad station not only a gateway to America's greatest city, but just as much a gateway to the nation's greatest African-American neighborhood, Harlem. I think that Williams's determination in life embodied an expression African Americans often use, making a way out of no way. People like Chief Williams often offer important lessons in personal industry and perseverance, and they remind us that the responsibility of caring for our own history and heritage rests within ourselves. I think Williams must now be considered, along with Cornelius Vanderbilt and Jacqueline Onassis, one of the great heroes of Grand Central Terminal's storied past.